Hello and welcome to the second revision video of Macbeth. So you should have completed the first video already that looked at the key quotes, the plot and the key context of Macbeth. So our DNA is going to test your memory. So pause the video here. What are the 8 key moments in the text? And as a challenge, what are the 3 golden nuggets that I talked about in the last revision video? Pause here and play when you're ready to carry on. So here are your answers. Tick them off, see how many you've got right, and try to consider putting these on flashcards. Knowing them will really help you in terms of planning and writing your essays. So this video is going to be focusing primarily on quote analysis and our plan of attack. What do we do when we have the question in front of us? So in terms of quote analysis, we're broadly thinking along the what, where, how, why. So the best way of doing this is contextualizing these quotes. Where do they come from in the play? Now for us, that's easy because we have tracked through our 8 key moments, and these are the quotes that we are definitely going to learn. They're our bare minimum. Then think, what is the broad idea presented in the quote? In our how section, that will then look at which words can we analyse with methods to explore a deeper meaning. And finally, why did Shakespeare write this? Are there any links to be made to the context or even elsewhere in the play? Making those connections will really help you achieve a higher grade. So this is our first quote. So remember, it's from the start of the play when we hear about Macbeth before we see him, and Duncan says, "Oh, valiant cousin, worthy gentleman." So this is my what. So I've said at the start of the play, we hear about Macbeth before we see him. This builds an image of him as being a hero who is highly valued by the king for his military prowess and violence on the battlefield, a quality that is celebrated when it is for the country. So that's my broad idea. So that's my what. That's how I would start my paragraph, and then I would present my quotation. However, most of my marks in a paragraph will have to come from the how. So this is my first one. So I've looked at the exclamation "Oh" creates the sense Duncan's extremely grateful and relieved that Macbeth was able to slay the enemy. He admires this bloodiness on the battlefield and he honours this bravery. And the tone is emphasised through the repeated exclamation marks, highlighting that Duncan believes Macbeth to be a hero. So I've really only looked at the punctuation and the O. There's still quite a lot left in that quote for me to explore. So I've looked at now the adjective. So the adjective valiant conjures an image of bravery and honour. Macbeth went out to risk his life by fighting for his country. This is corroborated by the adjective worthy. This might suggest Duncan believes Macbeth is worthy of a reward for his work for Scotland. The noun gentleman also implies that Macbeth is seen as honourable and worthy of a rank in the aristocracy, and Duncan later gives him the title of Thane of Cawdor. So when we hear it from the witches, it's no surprise to the reader because it's dramatic irony. We already know he's going to be Thane of Cawdor. It's a reward for doing so well in battle and for helping to save Scotland from an invader. So why did Shakespeare do this? So the fact that Duncan praises Macbeth so highly establishes him as a tragic hero. It makes Macbeth's downfall more shocking later. Now the reason for this is because the higher up we put the character, the further they have to fall. And that is the process of the play. That's the narrative arc. However, perhaps Shakespeare was cautioning James I against putting his faith in the wrong people. Duncan trusted the previous Thane of Cawdor, who went on to betray him, and trusts Macbeth, who does the same. Arguably, rulers should not judge men on their military prowess alone, as when turned on them, it can become treason. So perhaps it's a little warning, a veiled warning to James I about who he trusts, who his advisors are, making sure that actually he's choosing the right people who won't try to usurp him. So this is our next quote. So Macbeth has just heard the witches say he's going to be king, and he responds saying, "Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more." So when the witches prophesied that Macbeth will become king, this unleashes his hamartia, and his hamartia, as we know, is ambition. He already wants to know how he can make this come true. That's this desperation that we see in this quote. So let's look at how. So the imperative verbs stay and tell, so do you remember an imperative verb is a command, demonstrate Macbeth's desperation to find out more about his future, and he's captivated by the promise of becoming king. Additionally, the adjective imperfect also highlights his frustration with the information provided. The witches tell him his fate, not how to achieve it. So I'm also, in my second how, going to take this in context a little. So Macbeth's desperation to know more is in direct contrast with Banquo's response to the witches. Banquo notices how Macbeth is rapt with awe. He's almost entranced with the promise of kingship. It's like they've put him under a spell. But in contrast, Banquo is far more sceptical. He doesn't trust them at all, describing the witches as instruments of darkness, implying that he knows their intentions are evil. He doesn't trust them, and rightly so, because Banquo never loses his honour at any point during the play. So why? So the witches have shown that Macbeth's hamartia is his ambition. He's desperate to hear more, and his mind even jumped shortly after to murdering Duncan, even though he describes it as fantastical at that moment. So by comparing Macbeth to Banquo, presenting them as almost doubles, Shakespeare establishes that Macbeth doesn't listen to reason, and he doesn't remember, as James I suggested, that witches are women who have made a pact with the devil. Their intentions cannot be good, but Macbeth only wants to focus on his fate. All he can hear is that promise of being king, and he is well and truly under their spell. So here's our next quote. So this is all part of Lady Macbeth's desire for her own power and how she persuades Macbeth to ultimately commit regicide and kill Duncan. She even comes up with a plan. So she says, look like the innocent flower and be the serpent under it. So at the start of the play, Lady Macbeth is the driving force in Macbeth's decision to kill Duncan. Arguably, if it was left down to him, he wouldn't have done it. She encourages him to be duplicitous, so two-faced, for her own personal gain and empowerment, and she just wants to be queen. She is ruthlessly ambitious and is frustrated by the limitations of being a woman in the Jacobean era. So how does she do that in this quotation? So we have this biblical image of the serpent, which evokes a sense of duplicity. She instructs Macbeth to deceive Duncan and continue to earn his trust, conveyed through the adjective innocent. He's got to seem innocent. He's got to seem like he is on Duncan's side. It also alludes to temptation and original sin. Lady Macbeth could be linked to Eve and Macbeth could be linked to Adam. So arguably we could say Lady Macbeth is like Eve because she's driven in her pursuit of power. She doesn't need the time to think and reflect that Macbeth does, and it corroborates the concept that without Lady Macbeth, Macbeth might not have committed any form of regicide. I also want to look at the imperatives here. So the imperative look presents Lady Macbeth as the more powerful one in the relationship, which is highly unusual for the Jacobean era. And we see this through this section of the text as she's got conversational dominance. He can hardly get a word in edgeways. She drives the conversation. She has taken control of Macbeth's destiny and pushes him to commit regicide and provides the instructions to do this successfully. However, although Lady Macbeth encourages Macbeth to take action and she callously criticises him for his lack of masculinity, she only does this when he considers not following her instructions. And actually, we must notice that she is unable to commit the act of murder herself. Partly because of her gender, she's a woman, so she can't take action. But later, as Macbeth is in Duncan's room, literally carrying out the murder, she admits that she couldn't do it because Duncan looked too like her father when he slept. And actually, that's the first moment of compassion that we see from Lady Macbeth at all before she goes mad. So why? Why did Shakespeare do this? So he demonises Lady Macbeth here by using manipulative biblical imagery. She serves as a reminder to the Jacobean audience that evil can exist within us all. However, to diminish the frightening and scandalous presentation of a powerful woman, he associates her with the supernatural. She calls on spirits to empower her to force Macbeth into regicide. And this reflects James I's view that women were more sinful than men, but also perhaps shows the patriarchal exclusion of women from power leads them to find it by more manipulative and duplicitous ways. So maybe Shakespeare might be implying perhaps we should give women a little bit more power, because then they won't have to behave so deceitfully as Lady Macbeth does. All she wants is some power. So now we're in the middle of the play. Macbeth says, "Will all the great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" He's just killed Duncan, and this is his response. So what's the idea here? So after Duncan's murder, Macbeth is totally consumed with guilt. He knows he's committed the greatest sin of all against both God and the king, and he knows he has to be punished. So we'll start with the proper noun Neptune. This references the Roman god of the sea. It demonstrates Macbeth's crime against the Christian God is so great that he's been rejected and must turn to another. So now that he's committed the sin, he can't get to heaven and he needs help from Neptune to cleanse him of the guilt. Now, this whole statement is actually a metaphor, and it demonstrates Macbeth's guilt and his conscience. He is stained metaphorically. There's blood on his soul, as well as literal blood on his hands, because he has just come from killing Duncan. And he acknowledges that not even the ocean can cleanse him due to the significance of the sin he has committed. Now, interestingly, this is a direct contrast from Lady Macbeth. Although she's not actually committed a murder, she has been into the room, she's smeared the sleepy grooms with blood, and she says, "My hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white." She feels absolutely no guilt at all, and she condemns Macbeth's cowardliness by using this image of whiteness to show purity. So why has Shakespeare done it? Here, he is explicitly cautioning the Jacobean audience against committing regicide. So in the wake of the Gunpowder Plot the previous year, James I was afraid of assassination. So Shakespeare uses Macbeth to demonstrate the dire consequences of the crime. It's corroborated by Macbeth's inability to sleep and say amen. Shakespeare is suggesting he cannot be forgiven for this sin. So in the middle of the play, we'll have the appearance of Banquo's ghost. Now remember, Macbeth has hired murderers to go and kill Banquo and Fleance, and at a dinner, he sees the apparition of Banquo appear sitting in his seat. Macbeth says to him, "Thou canst not say I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me." So what's my idea? So the appearance of the ghost highlights Macbeth's disturbed state of mind by the middle of the play. He's murdered his best friend and he's haunted by his actions. However, ironically, as Banquo appears, Macbeth is duplicitously apologising for Banquo's absence, which does seem very, very strange to the other Thanes. So how do we see this in the quote? So the direct address, so we have thou and thy, they demonstrate that Macbeth is talking directly to the ghost that the other Thanes can't see, highlighting his loss of control and his fear. By saying that Banquo can't not say that Macbeth killed him, he is arguably admitting his guilt. As Macbeth hired murderers, this shows he's politically strong but morally weak, highlighted by Banquo's appearance. Despite his best efforts not to be associated with the death, he is. So the fact that Macbeth is speaking to the ghost that nobody else can see, it's clearly a Banquo, it just makes him look totally guilty. We also have this image of gory locks, and it's gruesome. It evokes this sense of horror from both Macbeth and the audience. We also have the verb shake, which creates an image of Banquo condemning Macbeth's actions. He was the only other person who knew what the prophecies were, and after Macbeth was crowned king, he feared that he played most foully to get the crown. So Banquo had his suspicions all along. Arguably, Banquo's only crime was his silence. He should have taken action against Macbeth when he suspected foul play. So perhaps the shake of the head is also expressing disappointment with himself. Maybe his death could have been preventable if he had turned Macbeth in. But why? Why has Shakespeare done this? So again, he uses Macbeth as a vehicle to warn the audience about the sin of murder. The Jacobean audience would have been extremely frightened by the appearance of the ghost because remember, we're living in very superstitious times. But as the other thanes and Lady Macbeth can't see it, arguably it is a hallucination caused by Macbeth's guilt. So his guilt is getting worse. It's worse than what it was when he killed Duncan. He's now killed his best friend and totally betrayed him. So Macbeth, after the appearance of Banquo's ghost, wants to find out more as he feels so insecure about his place on the throne. So he visits the witches who tell him to beware Macduff, and he makes a plan to hire again murderers and kill and attack Macduff's children. Meanwhile, Macduff has gone to England to try to convince Malcolm, the true heir, to come back to Scotland, attack Macbeth and take his rightful place on the throne. After this conversation, Macduff receives the news of the death of his family, and this is his response. "Oh, hellkite! All? What, all my pretty chickens and their dam at one fell swoop?" So what's my idea here? So Macduff can be seen as a foil to Macbeth throughout the play. So by a foil, I mean an opposite. He's Macbeth's nemesis and he ultimately defeats him. Macbeth's decision to murder Macduff's children is shocking as we see how much sin he's prepared to commit against innocent children. Macduff's response to this is initially grief, but this is the spur to overthrow Macbeth. So how does our quote show that? So first of all, there's the exclamation, "Oh, hellkite." It highlights Macduff's horror at Macbeth's actions against his vulnerable and innocent family. And we have a fragmented sentence structure throughout the scene, but also in this quote. And the repetition of all through the conversation also emphasises his distress, but also his disbelief. He can't believe this has happened. However, because he keeps going all, it might also imply that though he expected there may be an attack on them, he did not expect all to be killed, perhaps leading the audience to question his decision to leave them in the first place. We also have animal imagery. So we have the pretty chickens and their dam, so the mother hen. So the animal imagery presents Macduff's wife and children as innocent, and it echoes very much Macbeth's reference to his wife as dearest Chuck. He tells her, "the innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck," when he's preparing to kill Banquo. Now these are people who need protection, they need love. However, Macduff's absence from them implies he didn't protect them and he failed in his role as a father and a husband in the Jacobean era. Just like Macbeth, who failed to protect Lady Macbeth from the knowledge of the murders, because she reveals that she knows them in her sleepwalking scene. So why did Shakespeare include this? So while Shakespeare presents Macduff as Macbeth's foil, so opposite, Macduff's response to his family's death is markedly different from when Macbeth realises Lady Macbeth is dead. Macduff is consumed by grief initially, but believes, unlike Macbeth, this is a sign of masculinity. He says he must feel it as a man. Whereas Macbeth reacts without pity or remorse. He doesn't really seem to care that much when he hears Lady Macbeth is dead. However, like Macbeth, Macduff uses their death to be the whetstone of his sword, and it leads to his desire for revenge, just like when Macbeth is driven on to fight to the bitter end. Arguably here, Shakespeare is questioning, what does it mean to be a Jacobean man? The true man in the play is Macduff, but he is not without fault. So now we start to go into Act 5, some of the final points of the play. So Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking in this scene and she's very, very distressed, and she says, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh." So what's the idea? So at the start of the play, Lady Macbeth is powerful and she's the driving force. But by Act 5, she's fallen into madness and hysteria caused by her guilt. Through her sleepwalking, she admits the murders that have been committed in the Macbeth's quest for power. So how do we see that in this quote? So this metaphor is interesting. It has an echo of Macbeth's earlier quote about Neptune's ocean that we talked about before. They're both wishing that a higher power can help them be cleansed of their guilt. Now we also have a very hyperbolic image the perfumes of Arabia. And this reinforces her acceptance in her part in the regicide, but also she realizes her conscience is stained. She's in a considerable state of distress, which might be caused by guilt, but it also might allude to the horror that she's realized she will be punished for her crimes, leading the audience to question her selfishness even in her madness. We could arguably say she's been selfish throughout the play. She wanted Macbeth to kill Duncan so she could be queen, and now she's realised she still wants to get to heaven. We also have the triple exclamation of, oh, perhaps it does sound like Lady Macbeth is crying, which is a sign of vulnerability, regret, but also femininity, as it's very emotive. It's only at the very end, when she has reverted to the Jacobean role of woman by demonstrating a show of emotion and hysteria, and ultimately she is helpless. And this is corroborated by these unstructured prose, where she speaks in poetry previously in the play, and that shows her loss of control and her mind is chaotic. She's very disturbed at this point. So why? Shakespeare exposes the emotional punishment here of committing regicide by demonstrating this mental torture that Lady Macbeth is experiencing, once again cautioning the audience against the crime. However, and this is a slightly more complex idea, Shakespeare might be criticising the patriarchal society. Despite Lady Macbeth's initial power over her husband, she was never able to achieve power in society, which may have been the reason for her deceit and manipulation, leading to her downfall. She was always going to be second fiddle to Macbeth, who was king because he was a man. Perhaps then Shakespeare's implying women are at the mercy of the chain of being. Maybe even he could be suggesting that we do need to give women a little bit more power so they, like before, don't revert to these duplicitous, scheming ways of achieving it. Now, this is the very end. So Macbeth has fought with Macduff and has been executed, and his head has been brought into the hall and put on a spike. Malcolm is now being crowned king, and he's the true heir. And he describes Macbeth as this dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. So what's the idea? So interestingly, the play started with the execution of a traitor and ends in the same way. The fact that Macbeth's head is brought in on a spike demonstrates the punishment that will be given to anyone who commits treason by regicide. So how? So firstly, let's deal with the image of the dead butcher. Now these connote Macbeth's bloody and murderous actions to usurp Duncan, who you must remember is Malcolm's father, but also his actions which maintain his wrongful place on the throne. An alternative idea is that it could suggest that Macbeth butchered Scotland, he caused a disturbance in the natural order, he allowed evil to permeate through the country, and he separated it, he divided people, he was a very divisive ruler because he was a tyrant. We also have the image of a fiend-like queen. So the adjective fiend-like describes Lady Macbeth as being cold-hearted and evil, which is exactly how she was at the start. It evokes a sense of evil, supernatural and monstrous behaviour because, just as the witches did, she coerced Macbeth into killing Duncan. However, arguably this epithet, so this little description, mainly condemns her for transgressing the role of women and inciting Macbeth's actions, because actually she never killed anyone herself. She was just the voice that encouraged Macbeth to do what he already wanted to consider. So why? Why should we end like this? Shakespeare uses the cyclical nature of the play, so it's a cycle, starts in the same way as it finishes, to warn James I of placing his trust in the wrong people, and also to lambast the sin of regicide and prevent any further attempts on James I's life. Shakespeare restores the natural order to the chain of being by crowning Malcolm, who's the true heir, by the grace of God. And all of this indicates the only way to maintain national harmony and peace is for the true king to rule. So now I just want to run through our plan of attack. So this is what your question will look like. You'll have a small extract. So here we have a section from Act 5 when Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking, and we have a question. So starting with the extract, how does Shakespeare present guilt and madness in the play? Write about how Shakespeare presents guilt and madness in the extract, but also how he presents guilt and madness in the whole text. So, because we need to comment from the whole text, we need to learn some quotations. So make sure that you know the ones that I've just taught through now, as well as any extras that you think will be helpful to get you beyond the grade 5. So if I have a look at my extract, I need to annotate and read first of all. I need to find between 2 and 3 quotes here that I think I can explain in detail, and to make sure that I can talk about context as well, because that's really important that I drop that in every time I talk about a quote. Now, if I'm a bit stuck, I can't find 2 to 3, I just do what I can. I might just have one really good one, and I'll just use that and then use quotes from elsewhere just to build on that same point. Now, I might be really stuck. So at the top of the extract, there will be a small description. There's an overview of what happens in the scene. I will just refer to that, and I will move straight to the stuff I know. Now, we only do this in an absolute case of emergency if you can't use the extract. It's your very much last case scenario. So we have 2 options to write the plan. So option 1 is a little bit more complicated. If you're aiming for the 7+, follow this one. So you'll choose 3 to 4 things in the extract that you can link to the wider play about that theme or how that person reacts, in this case, madness and guilt. For option 2, if we're aiming for the 4 to 6s, think about it chronologically, write about the extract, and then choose 2 or 3 other moments in the play that you can write about the same theme. So you go beginning, middle and end, and you'd slot in the extract where it falls chronologically. So let's talk about option 1. So here it's the theme of guilt and madness. So in this extract, Lady Macbeth admits her guilt in her madness. She says what she did. She talks about how Duncan was killed. She talks about Lady Macduff. Now, this all links very neatly into the Banquo's ghost scene. Macbeth admits his crimes as Banquo comes and shakes his gory locks at him. My second point will be that she is consumed by guilt and the stain of her conscience. That's all she can think about, and that's what's led her to being mad. Now, this guilt is exactly like Macbeth after killing Duncan. The quote about Neptune would be perfect here, and looking at how he can't say amen and he will no longer be able to sleep. It's all about that sense of being stained. You cannot undo things. What's done cannot be undone. And then finally, I'd like to look at the contrast. So Lady Macbeth descended into madness at the end, whereas she was strong and she forced Macbeth to commit regicide initially. So this is a stark contrast, and just like I did at the final quote, I might talk about how it argues that women may have a little bit more power. Perhaps it subtly criticises the patriarchy. Now I've also got option 2. So this is my works example. I've gone beginning, middle, end, and I've slotted in the extract where it falls. So it's not quite the end because Macbeth isn't dead yet. It's just before that. So that's where I've put my extract. So I've gone for at the beginning, but we have Duncan's murder and we feel Macbeth is guilty after killing Duncan, whereas Lady Macbeth is not. So he's asking for Neptune to cleanse him. She is saying she's shamed to wear a heart so white. In the middle, we have Macbeth feeling guilty for having Banquo murdered. Thou canst not say I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me. Then I'd slide in my extract. I would use my quotations. I use 2 to 3 in this paragraph because it's there. I want to use it. So Lady Macbeth's madness and guilt for driving Macbeth to commit regicide. She openly talks about Duncan. Who'd have thought the old man to have so much blood in him? And then by the end, Macbeth becomes more clear in his thinking, and he doesn't have any sense of guilt in the final scenes. He just shows himself to be the warrior that he is. He throws on his warlike shield and he fights till the very end. So these are the 2 options to write effectively. So now it's your turn. Have a go. So here is your extract. It is from the beginning of the play when we hear about Macbeth before we meet him through the sergeant's account. So the question is, starting with the extract, how does Shakespeare present violence in the text? You must comment on how Shakespeare presents violence in the extract, how Shakespeare presents violence in the whole text. Well done, and off you go.